This is the story about the Webbs and Pancho Villa and how we worked together in the old days and some of the interesting things that happened. It all started with Uncle Gilbert. Gilbert Webb was a rancher, store owner, railroad builder, and a beef contractor to the U.S. Army various times in his life. He was also the mayor of Pima, Arizona. This is the Webb blacksmith shop, reconstructed now in Nauvoo, Illinois. James Webb Jr. joined the LDS Church in 1835, and he and his boys ran the Webb blacksmith shop. Two of his boys were Edward Milo Sr. and Chauncey. Edward Milo Sr. had Edward Milo Jr. Chauncey, one of his boys, was Gilbert. Edward Milo Jr. had some of his sons were my grandfather Frank and Frank's brother James Levi. Everybody called him Lee. That's my father, Carlisle Farr Webb, and Melva was his sister. My aunt Melva, uh, knew Pancho Villa quite well. So did my grandfather. That's me. Gilbert was a distant cousin once removed to my grandfather Frank, but everybody called him Uncle Gilbert. Now here's a painting holding up the pay escort by Frederick Remington. This was drawn from the accounts of eyewitnesses. This is a whole book and a half of history on how this all occurred. You can read about it, ambush at Bloody Pass, just Google the WOM, payroll robbery, interesting stuff. Whoops. Yeah, that's Uncle Gilbert. Gilbert Webb was the prime suspect in the WOM payroll robbery in Arizona, 1889. He allegedly made off with over 280 pounds of gold and silver coins, worth almost $1 million today. He was found innocent after a long trial in Tucson. Some called him and his gang the Latter-day Robin Hoods because he was always providing beef and jobs to the residents of Pima, Arizona. Some say the beef was rustled from the Army just after being sold to the Army and distributed to the town to dispose of the evidence. He left Arizona and went to Texas and then to Mexico. The money was never recovered. My grandpa Frank Webb's trail, how he got down to the Mormon colonies down in Mexico. He was born in 1879 in the little town of Orderville, Utah. Now, his father was the superintendent of schools at the age of 17 up in Fillmore. And when Orderville was organized, he was one of the founders of the little town of Orderville. Now, at the age of 10, his dad was building Snowflake Academy in northern Arizona. It took a couple of years. They built the high school, taught the teachers, set up the curriculum. And when they were through, the family went on down into the colonies, uh, you see down here in Mexico. But before the family got down there, when they're still building the high school, at age 16, I guess the family decided that Frank wasn't going to be a scholar and needed to learn a trade if he was going to survive in this world. And they sent him from Snowflake to El Paso, Texas, because this is about 6 years after the trial of Gilbert Webb. And Gilbert has made it to El Paso, and he's a bigwig with the railroad there in El Paso. And so Frank goes there to learn how to be a railroad fellow, how to dynamite. Well, at that time it was nitroglycerin, how to blast, how to lay track. And it was almost 6 years another 6 years, another 8 years actually before he sees his folks. Another 6 years, and as he visits his folks, he sees a pretty gal at the dance, and he tells Uncle Gilbert, "I'm not coming back to El Paso. I really think I need to stay down here and take care of my folks." Yeah, and so he does. So here's another look at the map. The orange area is where the LDS colonies were. You had Presidio, Texas. There already was a railroad that went from Presidio to Chihuahua. It was called the Kansas City, Mexico, and Orient Railroad Company. And a lot of investors in Texas wanted that line continued somehow from Chihuahua all the way to the coast so they could have a seaport here to get their goods back and forth. Well, my grandfather was married at age 24 up here in the colonies. And a few years later, he had asked Uncle Gilbert, "Yeah, I need a good paying job. I got a family. What have you got?" And he says, "No problem. We're working on a railroad down here in Creel, Chihuahua." And what he didn't tell him was nitro gone wrong had created a job opening. The guy that had his job was blown up. And so he gave Frank Webb the job of doing the blasting through the Sierra Madre on the Copper Canyon Railroad. Now, how did Uncle Gilbert convince the Mexican government to grant him contracts to build railroads in Mexico? Some say a bit of silver and gold changed hands, like maybe the proceeds of the robbery. Once he had that contract and he was running the show, he was able to give jobs on the railroad to all his relatives and all the cowboys that used to be with him out there in Pima, Arizona. He was able to send for a lot of them and give them good jobs to as a reward for sticking with him through the trial and everything. None of his cowboys ever turned on him. This is the area, a little blow up of the area around Creel. It's about 100 miles southwest of Chihuahua, where my grandpa blasted through the canyon, building the Copper Canyon Railroad. This is desolate country. A young Francisco Villa on his white horse. He, Pancho Villa, had legitimate ventures as well, including that of being a labor contractor on the Copper Canyon Railroad. That's from the Texas Cowboy Gazette. Pancho Villa was a natural leader and was very successful as a bandit. He was also involved in more legitimate ventures, including being a contractor on the Copper Canyon Railroad. That's from the California Native Newsletter. And then somebody organized the KC Mexico and Orient Railroad. Interesting anecdote is that Pancho Villa worked as contractor in this line. Ferromex Chepe Railroad history. There's 3 different historical footnotes showing they knew Pancho Villa was the labor contractor on this job. And he worked with my grandpa, who was overseeing the operation. Now notice a relatively young Pancho and his nice white horse. Pancho Villa's real name was Doroteo Arango. His duties for the railroad were to replace any workers quitting with fresh men and their wives and children if they had any. And he'd take them from Chihuahua, also haul all the supplies up to the railroad camp, and then up the mountains. There was no trail to drive a team at all. You had to put them on pack mule and haul it up the mountain. He had lots of free time between trips. Supplies had to be brought up on to where the work was going by pack animals. Aunt Melva, at the age of 3 or 4 years old, would sometimes get to ride in front of Pancho Villa on his horse as they hauled freight to the railroad camp. He teased her about her accent, but was impressed that the little girl could speak Spanish so well. Because typically little girls wouldn't learn, work Spanish as it was. If you went to school, the teacher would teach you proper Spanish. But she didn't go to school. She just hung around the railroad camp and knew Spanish from the people working there. Pancho Webb, all the workers called Grandpa Frank Webb Pancho Webb, was in charge of both the work crew provided by Doroteo and also a group of nearby Tarahumara Indians. They did the pick and shovel work, he did the nitroglycerin, later replaced by the nifty invention dynamite. Now here's my Aunt Milva in front of a tent at the camp up in the Sierra Madre about 1907. And from her book, The Harps on the Willows, she has one of the stories she has when they're trying to take supplies up the side of this mountain up to where the camp was. Thunder and lightning all around us in the dark. The wind was wild and whipping. Lightning might have hit one of the mules. It kicked and sent all the trunks flying. That scared Mama's horse, and it ran away up the side of the mountain. Mama fell, but her foot caught in the stirrup, and she was dragged along. All the men tried to rescue her. Finally, the horse got stuck in some rocks, and she was safe. Papa put Mama on his horse and walked the rest of the way. He put me in Villa's lap. Villa was the best horseman. That ride was very uncomfortable. The saddle horn bumped me in the ribs on one side, and on the other side I could feel the bullets Villa had in his bandolero. The handle of his pistol punched my back as we traveled slowly on. All right, remember, that's Pancho Villa's white horse. That is Pancho Villa. That is my Aunt Milva. And that's my grandmother, Edith. The picture was taken by my grandfather, Frank Webb. He was about 26 and Pancho is about 27 when they took this picture. This is up where the camp was. This was the little store that had the supplies for the food for the guys building the railroad. Now here's what this area looks like today, where it's all finished and graded out and a train rolling through. After a few years, Pancho Villa quit working on the railroad and with his gang joined the revolution. All during the time he worked on the railroad, he would disappear for a few weeks at a time, during which his various cattle rustling and mine robbing skills were honed. When he did not return, Grandpa Webb was happy because Pancho Villa used to make all the Mexican crew play poker with him and they'd win all their money on payday. Then Grandma Webb would hear all the sad stories from the wives of the poor men. Grandpa had to speak to Pancho Villa after Grandma heard of this, and he shamed him for using his intelligence to take advantage of the poor. Pancho later became a great defender and provider for the poor, and only stole from the well-off. And some called him the modern-day Robin Hood. Grandma Webb was very popular at the camp. She became the de facto doctor. She had a beginning Spanish textbook and was teaching herself how to read and write Spanish. She started a little school for the wives and children of the workers who would never have been able to go to school normally. In the evenings, some of the workers, including Doroteo, also learned reading and writing Spanish from Grandma Webb. Some years later, Villa kidnapped Lee Webb, that was Frank Webb's brother, and was going to kill him because the ransom was not paid. No one ever got the ransom note, but that's another story. At least we know Villa picked up something useful from his time with the Webbs. He could write. There's a picture of Levi, James Levi Webb, in Chihuahua, prior to his kidnapping. And here would be what Pancho and the boys looked like about the time the revolution's going on when he kidnapped Lee. General Pascual Orozco heard of the kidnapping And as he was a friend of Uncle Gilbert's, he and his army took charge of Lee and escorted him to safety. This and many more problems created by the Revolution convinced Frank Webb to get back to the States. He ran a successful dairy for many years in Tucson and was in the presidency of the Binghamton branch, later Bishop of the Tucson First Ward, for many years. He was in the Tucson City Band with Linda Ronstadt's grandfather, and in his last years was back in rural building, driving a Caterpillar. And the picture I got out of my grandfather's notes, he was still called Pancho Webb, November 1948, is just prior to when he passed away. Thank you.